The fog had rolled in thick over the captured fields of northern France, swallowing the sound of boots and engines until only the faint clatter of tin dishes remained. It was early evening, and the gray light was fading behind barbed wire and broken hedges. The war had been cruel that week. The British convoy had taken prisoners after a short and bitter skirmish near a small village that no longer had a name. Among the prisoners were 6 German cooks, still in their grease-stained coats, the smell of burnt flour and old soup clinging to them like guilt. They waited by an overturned field kitchen, hands raised, faces hollow from exhaustion and disbelief. A British sergeant studied them carefully. His men expected an order to search or to bind, but instead he asked quietly, "You are cooks, yes?" One of the Germans, a middle-aged man with soot on his cheek and eyes that had seen too many camps, nodded. The sergeant looked around at his weary company. Supplies were low, rations were cold, and the men had not tasted a proper meal in days. The decision came suddenly, born of hunger and something deeper. He told the interpreter to explain that the Germans would not be sent to the rear yet. They were to help prepare supper. At first the words made no sense. The Germans glanced at one another, waiting for the cruel joke. But the British soldiers had already begun to drag the field stove upright, to gather tins of corned beef and sacks of potatoes. Slowly, under the pale evening sky, the prisoners were unshackled. The oldest cook rubbed his wrists, unsure whether to thank or to fear the men around him. A kettle whistled faintly in the background. The air smelled of smoke, damp wool, and cautious trust. As the first flames flickered under the stove, conversation moved in short, hesitant bursts through the interpreter. Where had they learned to cook? What did they make for their officers? The Germans answered softly, their voices rough from days without water. One of them found a battered spoon, cleaned it on his sleeve, and began to stir a pot with the instinct of habit. The British soldiers watched, rifles still near, but lowered. A strange calm settled over the clearing. Steam rose into the fog like a ghost of peace that should not have existed there. For the first time in weeks, the British could smell real food. For the first time in months, the Germans could use their craft for something other than survival. The war seemed far away for a moment. Only the soft scrape of metal on metal and the low murmur of men who had forgotten to hate filled the air. None of them knew that this small act would be remembered long after the guns fell silent. Night had fallen by the time the stew began to thicken, and the damp air around the camp carried a mix of wood smoke, potatoes, and silent thought. The German cooks worked under the faint yellow glow of a lantern hanging from a rifle barrel. Every movement was cautious, deliberate, as if one wrong gesture could shatter the fragile peace that had settled over them. The British soldiers stood nearby, tired and watchful, their breath forming small clouds in the chill. No one knew what to say. The crackle of the fire spoke for them all. The oldest German, whose name turned out to be Otto, moved with the discipline of a man who had spent his life in kitchens where shouting officers demanded perfection. He tasted the broth, frowned, and gestured for salt. A young British private hesitated, then handed him a tin with trembling fingers. Otto nodded in quiet thanks, no words exchanged. Another cook, barely 20, began slicing onions with a dull knife that bit unevenly into the board. His eyes watered, and he wiped them with his sleeve, pretending it was the smoke. The interpreter, a thin Welshman named Evans, moved between the two groups, translating the simplest of words. It felt strange to hear laughter forming from both sides when someone made a clumsy joke about British potatoes being too hard to peel. Somewhere beyond the camp, an artillery gun fired in the distance, the faint thunder rolling across the fields like a reminder that this peace was temporary. The men fell silent again. The flames wavered in the wind, and the smell of stew grew stronger. A corporal brought a crate of bread, half stale but still good enough, and placed it by the fire. Otto tore a piece in half, offered it to Evans first. The interpreter hesitated, then accepted. The small gesture felt larger than the front line stretching across Europe. When the food was ready, they began serving in old tin bowls. The cooks ladled evenly, not favoring themselves nor their captors. The British soldiers waited until everyone had been served before sitting down on their packs to eat. A few nodded approvingly at the taste. One even clapped Otto on the shoulder, saying it was the best meal since Christmas. Otto smiled faintly, eyes glistening in the firelight. He could not remember the last time someone had thanked him. The fog drifted back in, wrapping the camp like a ghostly blanket. Shadows flickered across faces that had forgotten they were enemies. Somewhere a harmonica began to play low and uncertain, a melody from another war, another time. The notes trembled through the smoke and found their way into the hearts of men who had lost too much to remember why they fought. For a brief and fragile hour, the night belonged not to soldiers, but to men sharing warmth, silence, and the simple taste of peace. Dawn crept in quietly, its pale light spilling through the mist that still clung to the hedgerows. The camp was silent except for the crackle of dying embers and the distant murmur of trucks preparing to move. The meal had ended hours ago, yet no one seemed eager to disturb the fragile memory of it. Tin bowls lay scattered beside sleeping forms, both British and German, resting near the same fire that had united them. It was as if the war itself had paused to watch what had taken place in the night. Sergeant Miller woke first. He stretched stiffly, brushing ash from his uniform, his eyes finding the German cooks who sat apart, awake but unmoving. Otto, the oldest, stared into the coals, hands clasped tightly as if in prayer. Miller approached, the crunch of frost under his boots, breaking the morning hush. He stopped a few feet away, uncertain how to begin. Otto looked up, wary. The British sergeant cleared his throat and spoke through Evans, the interpreter, who had just woken. "The men thank you," Miller said. "You cooked well." The words sounded simple, but something in the tone carried weight. Otto gave a small nod and replied softly that it had been an honor to serve food instead of fear. Soon orders arrived from command. The prisoners were to be transported to a holding site near Calais. The brief moment of peace was ending. Soldiers began packing equipment, rolling blankets, checking rifles. The cooks watched silently, their faces unreadable. When 2 guards approached to escort them, a young British private stepped forward and offered Otto a small packet of tea wrapped in cloth. "For your next kitchen," he said awkwardly. Otto took it with both hands, eyes wet, unable to find the words. As the column prepared to march, the air filled again with the clatter of canteens and the murmur of engines. The fog thickened, softening every sound. The cooks were lined up, their hands tied loosely this time, not as prisoners, but as men returning to reality after a dream. One of them turned back once, glancing at the fire pit, now just gray ash. A gust of wind stirred the smoke into thin ribbons that vanished almost instantly. It felt like the end of something sacred, a secret that could never be told. Miller watched them go, his mind heavy. He wondered if, after the war, anyone would believe that one evening they had shared bread with those they were ordered to hate. Around him, his men were silent too, their eyes following the departing figures until they disappeared into the mist. Somewhere beyond the fields, the distant rumble of artillery began again, steady and cold. The moment had passed, but its echo remained, carried on the morning wind like a faint promise that not all humanity had been lost to the war. Years later, long after the war had ended and the guns had rusted into the soil, a letter arrived at a small post office in Surrey. It was addressed simply to Sergeant Thomas Miller, former British Army, written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. The paper smelled faintly of tobacco and sea air. Inside, the letter was in careful English, signed with a name Miller had not seen since that foggy evening in France, Otto Weiss, former German Army cook. The handwriting trembled slightly, as if shaped by hands that had seen too much time. Otto wrote that he had survived the camps, returned to his village near Bremen, and rebuilt a small bakery. He wrote that his ovens now fed school children instead of soldiers, and that every year, on the anniversary of their shared meal, he prepared stew and bread for anyone who came hungry. He ended the letter with a single line. "That night, we were not enemies. We were men." Miller read the letter twice before folding it carefully. The images came rushing back, the fog, the crackle of fire, the smell of stew rising into the night. He remembered the laughter, faint and nervous, as men forgot for a moment who they were supposed to hate. It felt like a lifetime ago, a dream that had survived the noise of history. He sat by his window watching rain slide down the glass, thinking how strange it was that peace could begin with something as simple as a meal. In Bremen, Otto kept his word. His bakery became known for its kindness. Former soldiers, widows, and orphans would gather there, sharing bread without knowing the story behind it. On the shelf above the counter sat a single photograph, a blurry snapshot taken by a British soldier in 1944. It showed a group of men around a campfire, faces half hidden by smoke, uniforms of two nations indistinguishable in the darkness. Otto never explained it to customers who asked. He only smiled and said it was taken on the night he learned that even enemies could feed one another. Miller never replied to the letter, though he kept it in a tin box along with his old service medals. He would take it out sometimes when the world seemed to grow colder, when headlines spoke again of division and fear. He would unfold the paper, trace the shaky handwriting, and remember the warmth of that impossible evening. The war had taken so much from both sides, but somehow in that forgotten corner of France, something had been given back. When Miller passed away years later, his daughter found the letter and sent it to a museum dedicated to stories of humanity during war. It rests there still, beside a faded cook's apron and a dented tin spoon recovered from a British camp kitchen. Visitors stop, read the note, and walk away, quieter than before. None of them know the taste of that stew or the sound of fog-wrapped laughter in a dying war, but they all understand what it meant. For one night, the world remembered how to be human. After the museum exhibit opened, the story of that single shared meal began to spread quietly through classrooms, documentaries, and whispered conversations among those who still searched for hope in the wreckage of history. Visitors lingered before the glass case that held Otto's apron and Miller's letter, staring not at relics of violence, but at the proof that decency had survived even in the heart of chaos. School children would press their faces close, asking the guides how it was possible for enemies to sit together in the middle of war. The guides always paused before answering, because no explanation ever felt enough. Outside the museum, a small garden was planted in memory of all the unnamed soldiers who had chosen mercy over cruelty. In spring, the air filled with the scent of thyme and rosemary, kitchen herbs, chosen deliberately by the curator. They grew in quiet defiance, as if to remind the world that even the soil, scarred by bombs, could give birth to life again. Every year, on the anniversary of the meal, the museum staff gathered there at dusk. They lit a small fire in a metal bowl, placed a pot of stew above it, and let the steam rise into the evening air. It was not a ceremony of victory, nor of mourning, but of remembrance. In one corner of the garden, an elderly man once appeared unannounced. His back was bent, his steps careful. He wore a dark coat and carried a faded photograph. The guards recognized him from the archives. It was Otto, older now, his hair white as flour. He stood before the display, his lips moving as if reciting a prayer. When asked by a reporter what had brought him there after so many years, he answered simply, "Because peace needs witnesses." The fire flickered as the sun disappeared behind the trees. Otto placed a small loaf of bread on the edge of the memorial stone and stepped back. His eyes glistened, reflecting both the flame and the memories it carried. Somewhere within the crowd, a young boy whispered to his mother, asking if that man had really cooked for the British. She nodded softly. The boy stared at the bread, as if realizing for the first time that history was not only made of battles, but of choices, small, quiet ones that rewrote the meaning of victory. When Otto passed away a year later, his bakery continued under his grandson's care. A framed copy of Miller's letter hung beside the door. The words had faded, but their truth had not. Every customer who entered was greeted the same way Otto had greeted his townspeople, with warmth, humility, and a piece of bread freely given. The scent of it drifted through the cobbled streets, carrying with it an invisible promise born in a night of fog and fear, that compassion could outlast war, and that even the smallest act of kindness might echo through generations.